Also, it seems like universal healthcare, at least in the 20th century, it seems to emerge after devastating wars, like almost in this kind of like revolutionary context where things are just absolutely obliterated. So the option is either like we come together and like fix this, or like we all die, because it's specifically in like Britain and other Western countries after World War II when these systems actually take root and develop.
But isn't that amazing? In order for capitalism to even have basic things for their citizens, it takes World War II and the threat of the Soviet Union to get them to concede a little bit. It's like people really don't seem to understand it. Capitalists really don't care. They don't want to build a welfare state for you. This was a very particular historical episode that required annihilation of millions of people, plus fear of Soviet Union being so attractive and communism that they change anything, not even a lot, just a little bit. And now we see that since the Soviet Union is gone and the threat of World War III, they have also just completely reduced down and broken a lot of their welfare that they built in the 1940s and 50s. Capitalism will never give us anything, even with the idea of regulated welfare capitalism. That can only be possible if there's a threat of real communism. That's only possible if you have much more radical program. If you actually ask for, the US is a great example, like people have been asking for single payer for over 100 years, 100 years, and they have been fighting it for 100 years at least. And silly us, we thought we would get it.
Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the podcast where we learn from people who have lived in, live in, or have studied extensively a socialist country. This is your host, Tony. And what you just heard is a gem from this episode discussion featuring Sopo Japaridze. Sopo is a co-founder of Georgia's Solidarity Network, an independent union. She's been a labor and community organizer in the United States and the post-Soviet Eastern European nation of Georgia. I highly recommend you follow her work on Twitter at SOPJAP, which is spelled SOPJAP, to get excellent analysis on modern Georgian events from a communist perspective. I also highly recommend Sopo's podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia. In this episode, we'll be discussing Sopo's recent article published in Jacobin entitled How Free Market Ideologues Dismantled Healthcare in Post-Soviet Georgia. And in doing so, we'll be talking about not only her memories of Soviet Georgia, but those of its workers, its nurses, its doctors, as well as family members and more. We talk about the origins of the Soviet socialist healthcare system, its operations, its historic outcomes, as well as its ultimate dismantling in the 1990s. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute, you can do so at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. By becoming a subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. For example, Sopo and I have an extended discussion outside of this episode where we talk about Sopo's concept of Soviet privilege, what the collapse of the healthcare system looked like, and also the collapse of the Soviet system looked like in Georgia. We also delve into some of the particularities of her union work. I'd like to take a second here to shout out to my new patrons in the last episode, and they are Telaj, Mattia98, Joey Ostos, Jay Coprario, Axel Barnes, and Tobin. I really cannot do this show without your support. If you're unable to contribute in this way, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review on your podcast platform, or even just a 5-star rating, as that really boosts the algorithm in my favor. I recommend checking out the back catalog too when you have the chance. As always, what you can really do to help this show is by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome our guest today, who is Sopo Japaridze. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you on the show here to talk about Soviet Georgia because I've started tackling individual Soviet socialist republics on the show. If you happen to be a new listener, the goal of this podcast is to speak to people who've either lived in, currently live in, or studied extensively a socialist country, and Sopo certainly fits that bill. It's common for people to kind of just gloss over the massive diversity that comprised what was the Soviet Union and forget that it was composed of 15 states and dozens of nationalities. One thing that always annoys me is when Americans kind of refer to the Soviet Union as the Russians, as if only Russian people lived in the Soviet Union, when I think they only really made up about half of the total population and many other different minority groups, of course, in the different states. So, I've certainly glossed over that when talking about the Soviet Union sometimes on this show. Another thing that I think is kind of a pet peeve as well is when people call every Eastern Bloc country a Soviet country. So sometimes you see people refer to things like, Soviet Germany or Soviet Poland and stuff like that. So as a corrective on this show, what I've tried to do is focus on places like Latvia. I've recently done a couple episodes on the Soviet Republic of Latvia. I've done episodes on the northern peoples, the indigenous peoples of Russia. And so this episode, we're going to really get in depth about a very specific topic about the Soviet Republic of Georgia. We're not going to do kind of an overview of the history, so I recommend people listen to Sopo's podcast, which he's a co-host of, which is called Reimagining Soviet Georgia, which is an excellent podcast which delves into both past and present realities of Georgia, as well as a whole host of other topics in relation to communism, again, both past and present. So healthcare is something that's come up a lot on this show, of course, because it's a major focus of socialist countries. It comes through in talking about, say, for example, the physical quality of life outcomes in socialist countries. On the show, we've talked about Cuba's system, particularly when it comes to abortion access. And of course, we've also talked about how the Soviets played really the most consequential role in ending the smallpox virus, the epidemic of that. So we're going to be doing a more holistic approach to the entire system of Soviet or socialist healthcare by looking at this example of Soviet Georgia. And we're going to be using Sopo's article kind of as a guide for us here. An excellent article is available on Jacobin, and the article is entitled, How Free Market Ideologues Dismantled Healthcare in Post-Soviet Georgia. So let's get started here then. So Sopo, why did you decide to write this article for Jacobin, focusing on Georgia's past and present healthcare system?
We had done a research project about the consequences of privatization of healthcare in the last couple of years. The Jacobin article came from that. What was striking to me was our research didn't really reflect that as much. I'm trying to do some more research now about the more Soviet side, because our work was a lot about post-Soviet. So when you were studying post-Soviet healthcare, you just see a complete crash of all these markers, like life expectancy is like the only thing that's kind of recently gone up. How sick you are, from chronic diseases and so on and so on. Everything has gotten worse, literally everything. It's very stark. It's also amazing how, despite having facts you presented to people, the sort of neoliberal, free market champions, they came to our meeting where we were discussed the markers today and how everything has gotten worse. And they're just like arguing to death, denying it, like trying to harp on certain statistic. Just, they cannot accept it. Like they refuse to accept reality of how things are worse. It's quite amazing. Everybody else is like, of course it's gotten worse. And then the people in charge keep telling you it's gotten better. So everything they always say about the Soviet Union in terms of like propaganda and convincing you this reality was a reality. It's like everything they do. So I was writing this article and I'm looking at the Soviet side, and what was really stark for me was in Georgia, there was a social democratic government for 3 years before the Soviet Union, before we joined. So it's like a slightly different trajectory than every other country. But so let's start with, say, even during the social democratic government, they really weren't able to improve that much in terms of healthcare, because first of all, they didn't have enough time. And also because once you join the Soviet Union, the ramp up of Stalinism, right? The 5-year plans, you're getting sort of leaps and bounds in improvements because it was a very fast catch up to everyone else. You have people, these young, dedicated revolutionaries, grappling with collapsing countries, collapsing people. They're sick. There's like extensive articles and research about the conditions of working class people in Georgia. Miners who are sleeping outside. They don't even have a home. So in the summer they sleep outside, and in the winter they sleep in the mines. They are sick often. Factories are in horrible conditions. Our river that goes through the city is toxic. It's all the factories are dumping their stuff in it. It's even sometimes the soap factories, like dumping in soap and poisoning it. There's not a lot of trees and so on. If you look at it, you are facing a serious crisis with no money, green people who've never had experience ruling. And you're doing everything possible to get your population healthy. And not just healthy in the sense of very limited understanding of healthcare, but they're socialists, right? They're communists, they read Marx, and so they understand that most of these conditions of people are sick is not a biological threat only. This is because they don't have a home. Is because they don't have clean water. Is because they don't have all these things. That's why people are sick. So it's about improving their conditions at home, as in giving them a home, making sure they have a safe home, making sure their water is good, their children are taken care of, and so on and so forth, and have enough to eat. So they tackle healthcare the same way they tackle everything else, understanding it's a holistic problem that must be approached in many ways. And then you have, fast forward, 1990, you already have everything set up. I mean, you have extensive, hospitals, you have trained medical staff, all of this, and your population is healthier. Like it's much healthier than it was in 1918. It's exponentially healthier, right? And the way you approach it is you dismantle this whole thing, get people sick. I mean, it's quite amazing how criminal this is, and just like how it's normalized. Like you had an actual functioning healthcare. It may not have been what you wanted, because it's always like they compare themselves to upper middle class service in the US, right? So it's like, sorry, we can't all have like, very wealthy people's money, and the way their living standard is always going to be much higher than most people. So it's like every Georgian who's like, liberal anti-communist will constantly compare themselves to the best of the West, right? Not to the worst of the West. And so despite that, so there may have been problems, sure, because in the 70s, there's like, you could tell there's like healthcare improving, and then it kind of sort of stagnates. But even with stagnation, even with all the things that I can say, it was exponentially better than it is now, right? It's like, it was still much better. I think when you don't understand the context and you only hear the criticisms, like, oh, this was bad, and this was bad, you don't really understand what was happening. People complained about everything. So even having really good services, people will complain, this could be better, that could be better. So if someone didn't understand that, they would just look at the criticism part and they'll say, oh my God, it must have been horrible, right? Because they're saying all these criticisms. And so like right now I was arguing with my aunt, which I often do. She just paid a lot of money for eye surgery. And so we're discussing like this would be free under USSR. And she's like, no, it wouldn't be free. We had to still pay, like you had to give the doctors like some kind of a little present. And I'm like, yeah. And then we interviewed those doctors. You know what they said? Well, as doctors, we didn't feel so great about getting bribes, but it's not like, oh, bribes the way we like understand. It's like literally like a present. Like you say, thank you. Usually it was also like chocolates and tangerines. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like always money. And they'll say, we didn't like that because we were doctors, and I feel like it cheapened us to accept it. So we just transformed them into fees. Oh, okay. So now, like before, it was optional to give anything. And it could have been like literally liquor, like your cognac, your chocolate as a thank you to the doctor. And that's supposedly what was bribery. And that was so horrible and corruption. Now you have to pay exorbitant fees, or they won't care for you and you will die. And this is supposedly better and less corrupt. Like, what are you talking about? It's like, how can you keep fooling people like this? Like, and most people who are not yet churned in the whole ideological machine yet, like they take you away until like you love Big Brother kind of thing. So they like propaganda. And then you're like, yes, it was totalitarianism, at the end, even though you didn't actually agree with any of it. Most people, and there's lots of people in Georgia who they still have memories and they have not been erased yet. They love the Soviet Union and they remember all the positive things about it.
Definitely, you mentioned the totalitarian view. It's quite popular in the West, popularly, even though many scholars are quite against it, or at least are moving towards a more, sophisticated view of the Soviet Union. But yeah, it's one of those framings of things where it's like, oh, the Soviet Union, increased education and literacy rates and access to education and things like that. But then it'll be like, oh, but they did it so that they'd have more power over the people, so that the state had more control. They always frame it in a way in which it's negative, which is, just bizarre. So it sounds like you wrote this article essentially to set the record straight in regards to the reality of Soviet Georgia's healthcare system, particularly in light of how it's going today.
Actually, the idea came from our nurses. So one of the other things I do besides podcasting, I'm head of a union here, head of a healthcare union, healthcare workers, nurses. So what was shocking to me, again, because a little bit about my background is like I was born in the Soviet Georgia and I left in 1992 to the US, part of immigration that was like the first wave of immigrants to the US because it was dangerous here. My brother was shot and almost killed. So we migrated to the US to sort of save his life. And my stepfather was Ukrainian and he was obsessed with the US. He thought it was the land of everything, opportunity and freedom, and he hated communism. So he was very happy to leave. My mother was not like this, but he was. And plus the addition of my brother, we went to the US and my mother immediately understood that this is bullshit. She actually was like shocked because I think she realized she had been lied to her whole life that America was great. She was shocked how no one read, everyone was really uneducated, everybody was so poor, everybody worked to death. She was shocked. So then after many years struggling in the US, especially around having papers and I had tons of problems as an immigrant and being poor and working class there. Once I was able to, I moved back to Georgia, which took me 22 years. So during that time, I had mostly met Trotskyists and sort of democratic socialist Trotskyists and sort of left-wing ultra-left. And so I had developed, despite myself, I had developed an anti-Soviet communist perspective like everyone else, because that's the only thing that's allowed in the US. So I was an anti-Soviet person who called themselves a socialist or communist. So when I came to Georgia, I very much thought that the Soviet Union had great ideas, but was fundamentally terrible. And that the Soviet Union had given up on socialism right away, right after Lenin's death kind of thing. So I'm speaking with workers constantly going to strikes and so on, and hearing that Soviet Union was actually really great in many ways. And they're explaining it to me in these very material ways. So it is the workers of Georgia that made me question my own understanding and challenged me to then dig deeper and find out that I was totally wrong about most things. Because at the end of the day, I realized I didn't really know anything about the Soviet Union. I had only known the polemics I was taught in these sort of groups and by people referencing certain years and them having their sort of gurus that had been writing anti-communist stuff for years. But I really didn't know what life was like in Soviet Union. I thought it was literally I imagined workers being enslaved in the mines or something and beaten if they didn't produce enough. This is conception I actually realized I had afterwards. I was like, oh, why did I think that? At the same time, holding on to this idea that, of course, where workers didn't work, right? Same thing, right? So either they were driven hard and they worked all the time, or it was of course, they only just drink coffee, like my aunt will say. No one works. No one likes to work. She thinks that about everyone. She's petit bourgeois, so. And so realizing people will be like, you see all this yellow dust in the air from the gold and copper being mined. She's like, this was not allowed in the Soviet Union. This would never be. We are now sick from this. We have cancer. This would never be allowed. So they would explain to me in these details how their life had gotten worse and how this was better in terms of how much food they got, how much rest, how much time they spent in the mines. It was all limited, very, very limited. So we're organizing nurses at some point, and all of we had some questions, a few questions, and the nurses are like, this is much better under socialism, or it's much better. They said, if the government owns all the healthcare, if it's not for profit, there should not be any profit in healthcare. It's criminal to have profit. And this is one of the reasons they say they have a lot of problems, because it's now profit-based healthcare. And I was like, wow, that's shocking. Because it was 70, 80% or something said that, And so that made me want to also dig deeper into finding out what was happening with the Soviet Union. What was healthcare like? What is it like now? Because it's so horrible now. Was it always this horrible? And so they're my inspiration for even doing this. And then on top of that, because no one was actually like, everyone does research here, but it's never actually like a meta research of what's like a political economy of the last 30 years. It's like, oh, here is like one tiny thing that I'm going to research that you will never understand in the context of things, you know? So we wanted to do a bigger research, like make bigger, bolder claims and base it all of, and we had this amazing like statistician who like went into the archives and got all these like great statistics about healthcare that was able to help us churn all the numbers and show that there was a huge drop in every kind of determinant. So that's like how I'm inspired to even write. And right now I'm continuing my research, reading all these old Soviet journals and stuff, which are amazing, just amazing to read and learn about how they're thinking. And it's always, every single thing is like how to defend socialism, like how to make sure that people's health, that people are served. And it's so all about how to make things better for people and how healthcare personnel should be thinking about others instead of themselves. Like it's so alien almost to see this level of care, even if it was like, some people say, oh, it wasn't always like this. Okay, sure, maybe in practice something, you know, failed, but the fact that you even try to have this goal is already beautiful, because you don't really see it anywhere else. So the kind of language that they use and write, and the amount of care that they write about is just not even existent anymore. Now it's like they don't have money. All the doctors are just told, keep asking, did you pay? Did you pay? Because if you didn't pay, we're not going to serve you. So just radically different.
I mean, it really goes to show that, you know, how history is used as a weapon, even though, you know, it's something that we, I think, generally passively consume. You know, maybe we learn about it in school. Some people may be interested in it, some people may not. Or if we do hear about it in other places, it's in like a movie or, you know, TV show, or as you mentioned, it could be a relative talking about their perspective of the past. Because history, as you've just explained to us, it spurs people into action, right? It makes you think about what could be. And if the history that, say, for example, that you're fed is one that's presented to you in a right-wing fashion, then of course the the politics that you're going to engage in, the society that you're going to build, even subconsciously, is going to reflect that history that you were told, because it's kind of like it sets the boundaries and sets what's expected. So no, that was great to hear what, you know, what spurred you to do this research. So again, everyone, go to Jacobin. The article's name is How Free Market Ideologues Dismantled Healthcare in Post-Soviet Georgia. It's excellent. We're going to talk a little bit more about it now, but definitely read the article. This is kind of a basic question, but I guess you could probably talk about it for quite a while. But how and when did the healthcare system emerge in Soviet Georgia? Like, when is it something that was at the start of its Soviet period or later on? And more kind of the circumstances for its emergence?
Immediately had to emerge because the reactionaries tried to kill the revolution. There were people that were already very sick from working in, as I said, in industries. It was a problem that was immediate and had to be tackled. Now, you also have to have the material conditions to be able to then enact your plans. So you can have tons of wonderful plans, but if you don't have the material resources, you are not able to do that. And this is the story of the Soviet Union. This is where the whole Stalinism, Stalin's 5-year plans emerged, because there was something called NEP at first, where it's like more about market-based, and then this wasn't sort of quick enough, and to play catch up in terms of industrialization, you have these very like severe 5-year plans that have included healthcare. So like a lot of the old stuff I'm reading, I'm reading this like 1939 Soviet medicine, all 12 issues, and in it, I'll say, so this is the concept, like, so this is how it was like before, and now what is it like now? So one of the things I learned recently was that malaria was actually widespread. Over 1 million Georgians had malaria before the Soviet Union. It's a lot. Like I'm kind of shocked by it. And then I was like, looked up more later on, and it was like, yeah, malaria was actually plaguing the Russian Empire, especially in the Caucasus where we are. They were trying to combat malaria, say. And so like they went from 1 million to like about in 1938, they have only less than 300,000 cases. And so they're going rapidly, like getting rid of malaria, say, for example. So immediately the task is there. They start building infrastructure for it, right? So there's like, first you have to build the committees and the sort of the political bodies that will oversee healthcare, then you have to get money to finance them, and then you have to build all these facilities. And the way it was set up was also genius, like slowly, the Samashko model, right? So which is you have every neighborhood has a doctor that you go to, like you have to go there. And then they like schools, sort of like, I don't know if in Canada, but every district has like school you have to go to. So you go to the local polyclinic, and then depending on what you have, they will then get you somewhere else that you need to go. So it's like they're sort of your guides in the healthcare system. Something's wrong with you. So you're not up to you to be like, I don't know where to go, who to go see, what's wrong with me, whatever. The chaos that is now, it is somebody who will help you, move you to the next step. But all of this infrastructure wasn't there at all. There was no infrastructure, no doctors, no nurses. Like imagine, very, very few people who are actually trained. Then you have to train doctors. Not only do you have to train them to be doctors, and you have to have people to train them, but you also have to train them to in a socialist medicine, as in for the people, and not some bourgeois doctors who only like treated rich people, right? So it's like a very different also mentality of like, at the same time you have to build these polyclinics. At the same time you have to build the hospitals. Then, as I said, healthcare to the Soviet Union was not just health. You have to have housing, so that you have to build houses for all the workers. You at least have to build houses at first for the doctors and the staff. And so this takes time. But this is going at very fast speeds. And so it's immediately. But they even have things like, this was amazing, they have something called kurortologia, which is like, in Georgia particularly, they in like 1930s. So they have something like resort science, kurortologia, which in 1926 is the institute first set up. And then later on, the whole I think 1934 is the faculty and the whole program of how to study resort science is built. And what does that mean? It's like one of the ways that people used to get healthy, and also just knowing that, good air and like rest and water therapy and so on, rehabilitative kind of therapy and stuff was really important to get well, especially for diseases that they didn't have vaccines for, or say like, like tuberculosis or something, like you require like longer term care. They built this extensive sanatorium systems. You have something like in 1926 already, resort science. Like imagine it. And they took this very seriously. They studied all the trends and all the research that was there on how to build these resorts up or make the ones that existed even better, that was only available for the wealthy. So they build trees, like they say, oh, we have built now, or we have planted this many fir trees. We have planted this many eucalyptus trees. And these trees are there to create the environment of health in the air. Like, so you can it gets like a certain kind of particles in the air where it makes you feel better. Eucalyptus, the same thing. So they're trying to, at the same time, as I said, doing all these other things, they're looking at health also in a way of resorts and sanatoriums, because workers, another important thing is rest, right? Workers were not given vacations before. Giving them vacation time, giving them rehabilitation, especially heavy industrial workers like miners. Their lungs, of course, about the black lung in general, they are underground. Imagine 200 meters underground, spending it for 7 hours. So they need all these extra things to feel better. And so the key was, and what I haven't said yet, but it's the fundamental keystone of Soviet medicine, is prevention. From beginning of when you're born till you die, you are constantly being checked by doctors. You have physicals. There's a doctor everywhere, in your factory, in your school, everywhere they can, in your neighborhood. So you're constantly being tested, seeing if you're well, if you need anything, so to prevent a lot of these diseases. And also collecting data on how work affects your health. So in factories, you have nurses and doctors constantly writing like, oh, they show signs of this. So, and then later on, over the years, like they see after 20 years of observation that these diseases or something, or like your eyesight goes or your hearing, None of that stuff exists now. I can give you examples. Like, we have metro workers, the ones who drive the metro trains. They did like an internal questionnaire. 67% never make it to retirement. They die because it's so physically draining to work underground. And the ones who do not die, their hearing goes, their eyesight goes, because it's so loud there and it's so dark all the time. No one's studying this anymore. No one compensating them. They used to have everything. Like, if you have heavy industry, if you're gonna, like, if you might be, your health might be compromised, whatever, they have extra money for you, extra vacations. Like, they have so many perks, and not just perks, like things they consider like you have to have, because you are putting your body in more danger. So here's all these things we're going to give you to make sure that you can have the healthiest possible outcome. Versus now, where the metro workers had to strike, they were making such low wages that they couldn't feed their families, especially having such draining job. And most of them they're not going to get very good pensions. The pensions here are ridiculous. They're not going to have extra pensions or any kind of, help in that sense to take care of their bodies and their families. This is the system supposedly that was so inhuman, right? They're like, socialism was this inhuman thing. Then how come everything they did from every detail was about trying to help people and save people and give them a better life? If you reduce it down to the executions of elites in certain times, then sure. But like I was saying this to my aunt, we have this argument. She's 86, and when I ask her, I'm like, have you ever seen a homeless person? She literally cannot think of one and tries to make up examples. She's an anti-communist. And I'm like, you're literally lying. Like, you don't even have, like, she's like, I went to the Regents once and I saw one poor kid. Like, this is crazy. She doesn't have examples. And then she once told me, why don't you read the Gulag Archipelago? I was like, are you kidding me right now? Like, you have no examples of your own. I was like, you lived 50 years in the Soviet. I was like, why don't you talk about your life and experience? She's like, there are bread lines. I was like, I know for a fact you've never stood in line for bread. Just things like this. Like, she straight up just lies all the time. This is why I don't trust people's accounts that are rabidly committed to anti-communism. They just lie. I know this from my family because they lie because they were trying to make a point. And then at the same time, my grandfather was this diehard communist. Our family was very poor. During communism is how we have anything, and how she even has anything. I was like, the reason you actually live in this nicer neighborhood and you never had to worry about anything is because of communism, and you don't even know it, And so I have my grandfather's letters where completely contradicts everything she says, her father. And she tries to distort his memory so she can have her anti-communist line, even though my grandfather is incredibly clear about his love for communism and saying how it saved him, his father, how he was not allowed to go to school because he was a worker's son, and so on and so on. He lists every single family, rich family that stole his land. He names them. It's really petty. I love it. He wrote all their names who stole the land. She'll be like, we're from a priestly class. We weren't peasants. I'm like, no, we were kicked out of our land and my great-grandfather had to work to make a living. It's all documented. And she will literally lie about our past. Our family were not peasants, that we came from this place with our last name that supposedly creates priests. It's like we haven't lived in that area for hundreds of years. We were kicked out, displaced 2 or 3 times before the Soviet Union, during the Russian Empire. So that's also just lie. If my grandfather didn't write those things, if I did not somehow get to them, and read them, my aunt is the oldest living person in my family. She would have completely lied and I would have never known the truth, right, about our family. And so I have to think how many people are like my aunt, how many people are like my family who are so committed to anti-communism, because first of all, they have a much more privileged life now. So they have the perks of the communism and the perks of post-Soviet, world. You have to think how many people are like this. We're just straight up lying. If this is why I'm everybody thinks I'm so mean, because I'll be like, I just don't believe you. People will be like, my grandmother told me she was starving and had 2 pieces of bread. I'm like, I'm sorry, I just don't believe you. I just don't, because people lie, And so, like, even with everything, like all the positive things workers will tell me about the Soviet Union, first of all, if it wasn't like also, if you look at statistics, if you look at the books, a lot of these things are true, you know? Sure, some people may remember nostalgia because they're younger, and there's lots of things like this, but you can actually, cross check a lot of their stuff. You could see it.
I just have so many things to say in response. That was excellent. Thank you so much for that. One is, do you happen to have a cat by any chance?
Yes, I'm really sorry. She's like constantly meowing.
It's all good. Hi, Sopo's cat.
She's named after Kama, which was a revolutionary, a Tbilisi Armenian revolutionary.
Awesome. Responding to some of the things that you're making me think about. So first, we were talking about how the healthcare system emerged in the Soviet Georgia. So with this in mind, this question in mind, I actually looked back to see if Marx and Engels had talked specifically about maybe how they theorized healthcare to operate in a socialist society. And apparently, and this could be wrong, and I'm sure hopefully someone will correct me if I'm wrong on this in comments, Marx didn't really talk specifically about healthcare, but of course it's kind of implied that that's part of building socialism. But Engels is specifically actually addresses it in his work, specifically in the book he wrote called The Condition of the Working Class in England, probably his most famous, or maybe not his most famous, but one of the most kind of consequential works of his. I'm just going to quote from it here quickly where he says, so this is a book where he was examining in detail scientifically what life was like for workers during this industrial age in the mid 1800s. So he has to say this. He says, I have now to prove that society in England daily and hourly commits what the working men's organs, with perfect correctness, characterize as social murder, that it has placed the workers under conditions in which they can neither retain health nor live long, that it undermines the vital force of these workers gradually, little by little, and so hurries them to the grave before their time. So that's like literally what you were just talking about there. And even the things you're talking about there, like the social determinants of health, of the different factors, of course, that impact our health, whether that's housing, as you mentioned, whether that's the specific working conditions, access to education, things like that. Engels actually kind of pointed out the social determinants of health before that was even really something healthcare practitioners would, determine in the 20th century. So I think we can make that into a meme of, one of the ones where like, oh, Marx never thought of this or Engels never thought of this, but actually they did. So that kind of, lays the foundation of where these ideas came from. Other thing I wanted to talk about was how you mentioned all this stuff is happening rapidly in the 1920s. And they're all doing these things for the first time that have essentially never been done anywhere to this level or at this scale. A part of Western history that isn't known as much is the fact that the Soviet Union was really an example during this period in the 20s and the 30s as they're experimenting and building their healthcare system for Western nations in developing what would end up being their own universal healthcare systems, whether that's in Western Europe or specifically, say, for example, Canada. Like in the 20s and the 30s, doctors in the Soviet Union would host conferences, international conferences, where they get doctors to come from everywhere, Canada included, of course. These doctors would come and they'd see kind of how these polyclinics that you mentioned were working, how these kind of the resort science stuff was working, and they'd go back home and be like, yo, like we have to do this. Like this is the future of medicine if we want to actually take care of the people that live in our country. And of course, it took some time for these ideas to take hold. Sometimes these doctors would come back and be like, hated for talking positively about the Soviet Union. But eventually these ideas laid the foundation for, particularly after World War II, Western countries, with the exception of the US, of course, implementing their own universalized healthcare system. So that's really cool for you to kind of break down specifically what that early period was like. Also, it seems like universal healthcare, at least in the 20th century, it seems to emerge after devastating wars, like almost in this kind of like revolutionary context where things are just absolutely obliterated. So the option is either like we come together and like fix this, or like we all die. I guess because it's specifically in like Britain and other Western countries after World War II when these systems actually take root and develop.
But isn't that amazing? In order for capitalism to even have basic things for their citizens, it takes World War II and the threat of the Soviet Union to get them to concede a little bit. It's like people really don't seem to understand that capitalists really don't care. They don't want to build a welfare state for you. This was a very particular historical episode that required annihilation of millions of people, plus fear of Soviet Union being so attractive in communism that they change anything, even not even a lot, just a little bit. And now we see that since the Soviet Union is gone and the threat of World War III, they have also just completely reduced down and broken a lot of their welfare that they built in the 1940s and 50s. Capitalism will never give us anything, even with the idea of regulated welfare capitalism. That can only be possible if there's a threat of real communism. That's only possible if you have much more radical program. If you actually ask for, the US is a great example, like people have been asking for single payer for over 100 years, 100 years, and they have been fighting it for 100 years at least. And silly us, we thought we would get it now.
No, that's a great point. I actually did an episode on this called How the Soviet Threat Benefited Workers in the West with Alice Malone as the guest for that episode. And she ran through different examples of how the Soviet threat, of course, the threat to the elites, not to the workers, forced concessions on their part. We talked about the example of the kind of ending of segregation in the U.S., for example, and civil rights legislation against racism in the West was, of course, as a result of the Soviet Union attracting third world countries or, decolonizing countries to their orbit because they were anti-racist in their perspective. And the U.S. was like, oh, shit, I guess we have to do something to not totally lose support. She talked about it in the case of healthcare, I guess in the broad sense of like fighting epidemic. Malaria was maybe one of the examples she even used in the sense that if the US and other countries don't support fighting these epidemics in the world, it makes them very vulnerable to communism, of course, right? Because the example is quite obvious that that would be the solution in those cases. So definitely people should check out that episode. And Sopo made a great point there. Also, I loved your kind of explanation of your own kind of personal family experience of how even history that someone may have lived through can be distorted by this anti-communist lens. That was very enlightening. One thing I also know about the Soviet Union, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily part of this Semashko system that you've talked about, but there was a huge emphasis that I understand on physical health, exercise, on people being active, whether that's through some kind of club or factory sports team or something like that. Which again goes against this. It's a Western image of particularly of Western leftists or whatever, socialists being that guy behind the keyboard who's like doesn't move and is like 300 pounds or whatever. And it's like, where does that even come from? Because it's like the reality is like so different. Because in reality, all communists are really like the mega Chad meme. That's more like it.
Just look at the propaganda. They always had really good looking men and women who worked out as the Soviet citizens,
Yeah.
Health in general. Actually, Lenin has this great passage, I forget which, I think he's like talking to Clara Zetkin. And he's like, revolutionaries should be like healthiest, we shouldn't be drinking or, wasting our bodies, but we should actually be playing sports and so on and so on and using all of our body and mind towards the revolution, right? This idea, of course, this doesn't mean that leftists in general have also been very much like sort of bohemian kind of types where, they drank a lot and they were like womanizers and so on, at least the men. And so you do have a mixture of people who are attracted to anti-establishment politics that are kind of hippies and so on, or, romantic, bohemian romantics. But Soviet Union, and Lenin was someone who didn't drink, was very much, he was kind of like health obsessed and so on. The idea is that a lot of the social ills are coming from bad conditions. So even like excessive drinking or not taking care of yourself and so on. All of this because of the conditions of capitalism, of alienation, of bad working conditions, and so on. So, of course, a healthy society would require also physical activity. And this is like a no-brainer, even though everything's now contested. But you have to move your body. It makes you feel good. It helps with thinking. It shows that cognitive ability is tied to physical activity, right? So many things. And they had working out in schools, at work, and so on. And then they had whole competitive sports division where sports was a huge part of life. Like for Georgians, right now we just won UFC champion Ilya Topuria. So and so it was a huge deal. Everybody's like, oh my God, Georgian won. And it's like so amazing. And the thing is, a lot of that culture of sports came from the Soviet Union. Having tons of clubs, ability to train in different fields like wrestling to even chess, right? It's considered a sport, to soccer, to whatever. And this was part of encouraging people to be social and to be healthy, and also sort of like fun, competitive thing that we can all do. Like unions had their own soccer clubs, they compete against each other. And it's like super fun. I went to a Metro Workers recently. They still have, does not attended very well. But Metro Workers were playing as a union, were playing against each other. And it was like super fun to go and see. So there's like this culture, working class culture. And also they took the best of the bourgeoisie. So they had like this high end aristocracy during the Russian Empire. What they saw were all these things that people had. And they gave it all to the workers, right? So when chess and things like this were only reserved for the very rich and the wealthy, they said, let's give the best to the workers, including also access to opera, to theater, to music, clubs to become like, there was all these, we have Norchis, so like this young whatever club, so like young mountain climbers and young journalists and young painters and young whatever. Kids from the early age were able to go and find their passions all for free, like put in different clubs and circles, reading circles, karate circle, this circle, chess circle, and so on. And that still kind of continues on, even though it's much, much, much less. It's people can't afford it as much, or all their money goes to putting their kids somewhere. As a kid, like I had, when I used to tell Americans my childhood, like I took ballet and piano lessons, German lessons and English lessons. And I vacationed with my vacation house and all this stuff. So I would tell like Americans about my childhood, and they were like, were you really rich? Like, were you royalty? It was like, what do you mean? Like, these things are only reserved for very wealthy people in the US. Most people have never seen a real piano, like they've never had ballet lessons, like, and so on. Not just physical culture, it's called piscultura, like both, it's called physical culture, so it's literally a culture of being active, but also access to culture in general was such a cornerstone of the Soviet Union, understanding of what socialism, socialist man, woman, whoever had to be. I look at it recently, I was listening to Byzantium, like this history podcast, and I was reading about Byzantium. And during the Roman Empire, there were like all these public things to do, lots of public life. And then with Christianity, people are like sort of go back into the home. It's like a private world takes over. And I like look at the Soviet Union, it's like in that way, like the Roman version, like secular experiment of all these ways people can be public and socialize. And then the collapse is like Christianity gets stronger. Churches are the only thing that's really there being built are churches. Churches are the ones that people are going to. There's almost no life outside of the private world and church now. So it's like, it's such a regressive step back to me, And so this public experiment that was based on improving not only yours, but also together we go forward, right? Together we move forward. We are interconnected. Even having all these experiments, how to cut across, so families are not the only thing you care about, right? So you care about other people. People don't naturally care for everyone. Like, I think we should stay away from people thinking that this is like, I'm just born, so I care about everyone. No, it's most people are like, whatever's around, it's like your family, whoever you're taught to care and love and empathize with, who you care and empathize with. And so there's always this strong emphasis on family, immediate, also loyalty, blood, and so on. But the Soviet Union did this beautiful thing where they said, we're going to give you all these different kinds of bonds, right? It could be through the sportsmanship and like camaraderie during playing sports, or when you're working out together in the school or factory. It could be, it's your coworkers that there's such a huge cohort of coworkers that love each other. They think of themselves as like family, During school cohorts, sticking with one class your whole life and having lots of experiences as a class, like literally a school class. So you can have ties, because I remember being like, somebody considered your classmate. That's one of the closest things you can be to someone. It's funny because it's not how Americans or Canadians feel. But this was considered, like, again, I use the word family because it's the only thing people understand. Very close. And then you have unions as well, promoting camaraderie as well. And then inter-ethnic camaraderie, right? Going to these like meeting points or inviting workers from other places, vacationing together, also connecting, empathizing with each other and learning from each other. So there's so many ways Soviet Union is trying to connect people and not just only be stuck in their little family. All of that gone. It's all gone overnight.
So, Sopo, that all sounds very nice and all, but have you read the Gulag Archipelago?
The only thing that's connected is the archipelago, right?
So no, thanks for that. That was great. Hopefully, I'm hoping to do an episode on Soviet sports eventually. So that's kind of a good kind of taste of that information, that knowledge. So with that said, I'd just like to thank you so much, Sopo, for joining us today. You've informed us, myself, the listeners, about a piece of Soviet history and Soviet infrastructure that most of us have never been exposed to. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of how the Soviet past is remembered in the Eastern Bloc, and maybe to sometimes take what we hear with more of a grain of salt and with a more critical perspective, and not through an anti-communist perspective. So yeah, thank you so much for joining the episode today, Sopo.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I really hope that you enjoyed that discussion with Sopo. A quick reminder, Sopo and I do have an extended discussion, which is available on the Patreon at patreon.com/AES the podcast. Thanks for listening.